even my second. It's the third language I wrestled with as a child, after Bengali, my mother tongue, which I still speak at home, and Hindi, which I've practically forgotten. See, my parents, who are in the audience, never allowed me and my sister to speak English at home. They insisted that we speak Bengali so that we could keep our culture close at hand. And even though me and my sister still speak English with each other all the time, my parents' logic did work out. I can speak Bengali pretty well. And so, by consequence, it always feels awkward for me to speak to my parents in any language other than my first. And in my second, while I can understand my parents' conversations, I can only respond to simple questions after piecing together words into a mess of a sentence. English, my third language, is the one I can most confidently express anything remotely complex in. The languages I can call my own are only a small part of the astounding diversity of languages in the world today, especially when you consider that there are over 300 languages spoken in the US alone, including over 160 native North American languages. Can you imagine that's 300 different ways to profess your love to someone, and then 300 different ways for them to reply back, "Stop following me!" And these 300 are still only a small part of the staggering 7,105 languages spoken in the world today or in the recent past, as cataloged by the resource Ethnologue Languages of the World. The most gifted polyglots can only manage to skim the surface of this number. I find it amazing that people can talk about the world using so many different sets of words and rules, or vocabulary and grammar. A very famous linguist by the name of Noam Chomsky had this idea that we're all born with the same machinery for grammar in our heads, meaning that we all share a baseline universal grammar. That universal grammar is then adapted and expressed into the grammars of all of the languages in the world today. Now, this idea has been heavily criticized, but I still find it interesting because it implies that we're all connected in a very innate way, and that all language is just a diverse manifestation of very basic human expression. However, given the immense diversity of languages, there are certain languages that are so different that scholars use them as evidence against this idea of universal grammar. The argument is basically that these languages are so weird that they can't possibly be related to the languages around them in a known way. A prime example of one of these languages is the Paraha language, spoken in the Brazilian Amazon. The language has words for the numbers 1 and 2, which also just generally refer to a small quantity and a large quantity, but beyond that, they have no numbers. Their words for color are restricted to a simple light and dark, and their language can also allegedly be whistled. Such immense differences between their language and ours makes one question the universality of grammar, but I like to pull a different conclusion. The diversity of human language is really representative of the diversity of human thought, and when we learn a new language, we're making a headfirst dive into this diversity. And trying to understand this diversity by learning another language leads to some very important introspection. Think about it, when you have to split a sentence into its constituent grammatical parts, and then shove those constituent grammatical parts into the different grammatical cubbyholes of another language, it really forces you to think about what those constituent parts were themselves. Basically, it forces you to think about what you wanted to say in the first place. And for me, this is more than just tense and mood and conjugation. It's also what idiom and what connotation and what sentence structure and what wordplay might convey a similar but still slightly different meaning. The act of transforming your thoughts from one language into another is like trying to tell the same story but with different characters, or like trying to make the same music but with different instruments. And to do so, it really forces you to think about what music or what stories or what meaning you were trying to convey in the first place. There's value in trying to understand what the preconceptions and the substance behind our old ideas were. And this is something I really love about language learning. It makes you think about what you want to say, and then it makes you say it differently. However, getting to the point where you can express yourself confidently in a foreign language is a little difficult, as I'm sure anyone in this class who's taking a foreign language can understand. See, there are many words and phrases that people say are lost in translation. that may seem standard and concrete in one language, but when we try to find their counterparts in another language, it leaves us fumbling for the right words. You know, like those countless images on the internet that say at the top in bright big letters, beautiful untranslatable words in other languages that you will probably never learn. I mean, do native speakers really even say these words and phrases, let alone find them special? Or are they just ordinary? I mean, well, let's face it, we're probably never going to be able to speak a foreign language as well as a native speaker can. So are we really going to be able to understand those words or those phrases or those terms of speech that native speakers can just so easily sprinkle on top of their conversations? Or is it just hopeless? Often it seems that we're painted a picture that we're restricted into the languages we speak from birth, and that unless someone spends years rigorously studying a language, they won't really ever be able to express themselves confidently in it, let alone speak it without an accent. And yet still, there are those bloggers that seem to learn a new language every month with little difficulty. Comparing their progress to yours, or even worse, comparing the abilities of a native speaker to yours, can make any progress on your part, however important, seem rudimentary and inconsequential. And suddenly, the language becomes something dark and menacing, something too giant for you to manage, let alone master. At that point, many just box themselves into this mindset that they're just not cut out to do something like that, or that they're just not in the right circumstances. And you're left with a dull pulse of envy and inferiority that creeps up whenever someone else achieves something that you thought was too high up above you to even reach. And this mindset is not just in language learning, it applies to many other aspects of life as well. But I personally have felt this in language learning. See, as I was growing older, I grew more and more frustrated with my inability to speak my forgotten second language correctly, Hindi. I would get ashamed when my parents' friends from college would ask me how I was in Hindi, and I would respond back in English, not because I wanted to, or because I didn't care, but rather because I couldn't respond back in any other way. And when I did have to speak Hindi, I went with my gut feeling, choosing whatever tense or ending I thought was correct. And one thing I learned was that my gut was often very, very wrong. Until one day, I glanced across a vendor's table at a community festival, and I found a little tiny book with the title, Hindi Grammar. Now, when I saw that title, the first thing that went through my mind was, grammar? Why did I think of that before? For the longest time, I had been fumbling because I couldn't make sentences correctly in this language, and this book showed me how to. As I flipped through it, the idea of Hindi in my mind shrank from something dark, menacing, and giant to something that I could easily hold in my hand. And when I decided that I could, or rather that I would start learning this language, I got much better at it. I'm still not very good, but it's getting there. And see, Hindi was never even really a foreign language per se for me. It was very linked with who I was, or rather who I am, and who I want to be. That, along with this book, written in broken English, showed me that I could conquer this language. I found motivation because there was an important sense of self-fulfillment attached to this idea, and also because at that point, Hindi stopped being a problem and started being a goal. This is really why I started loving languages in the first place. They taught me that problems are so much easier to deal with when it's personal and when you shrink the idea of that problem in your mind down to something that you are ready to tackle. These are among the things that I would say I found in translation. Firstly, that the human race is diverse yet connected in unfathomable, unimaginable ways. And secondly, that dealing with a tough problem involves just a little bit of impetus and a step back. Thank you.